Welcome to the Explainer. I am so incredibly thrilled to have you here today because we're going to explore the surprisingly nuanced administrative structure of the early Islamic state in Medina. We often think of 7th century governance as strictly top-down, just absolute monarchs calling all the shots. But as we unpack the sources today, we're going to see a fascinating, really delicate balance of local elections, decentralized power, and executive authority. It's an absolutely fantastic way to learn about the realities of historical statecraft. So let's just dive right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this roadmap. We're going to cover 1. The rule of 3, 2. Local chiefs and devolution, 3. The military chain of command, 4. Retaining tribal leaders, and finally, 5. Executive veto and suitability.
Starting off with Section 1, the rule of 3. To really understand the foundational concept of Islamic leadership, we have to start at the absolute smallest possible unit of society, which is a tiny group of travelers out in the open country or the desert. Now, what's really interesting here is that even in a vast, empty space, structured leadership is an absolute requirement. This sets the baseline for the entire state apparatus. This principle dictates that it's actually not permissible for even 3 people to be wandering in an open desert without appointing one of them as their Amir or their leader. So what does this all mean? Well, it tells us that governance and accountability aren't just reserved for massive, complex cities. They are literal, basic requirements of human social interaction.
Moving right along to Section 2, local chiefs and devolution.
Transitioning from that isolated desert into the bustling neighborhoods of Medina, we look at the Aws and Khazraj tribes. These tribes, who were united together by Islam as the Ansar, or the Helpers, were actually subdivided into what you could call devolved mini provinces. And here's the kicker. The central authority, the Prophet, didn't just unilaterally appoint leaders for these subdivided clans. No way. Instead, he explicitly ordered the tribes themselves to bring forth 12 elected chiefs, known as Naqibs. His order was crystal clear. He said to them, "Bring out to me from among you 12 chiefs so that they may be in charge of their people." The tribes themselves had to hash it out and make the selection.
And demographically, this played out perfectly. They brought forth 9 chiefs from the Khazraj tribe and 3 from the Aws tribe. Now that split accurately represented their respective populations at the time. By having the tribes elect their own representatives proportionally, it ensured that these chiefs had genuine local support and, absolutely crucially, the complete trust of their local communities.
So the crucial point is that this established very strict jurisdictional boundaries between these newly elected local chiefs and the central government. The Sahifa, which served as the constitution of Medina, made this totally clear. These Naqibs had full authority over their clan's neighborhood administrative affairs, but, and this is a big but, they were only emirs of a neighborhood. Their powers strictly excluded state-level policies like taxation and military expeditions. For matters of common security, sure, the sub-tribes would assist, but they had absolutely no autonomy to pursue separate, rogue agendas outside of the central state's authority.
Which brings us to Section 3, military chain of command.
Let's shift our focus from local neighborhoods to the battlefield, specifically the Mu'tah military campaign, which was the very first clash with the Byzantines and their proxy kingdom in southern Asham. This campaign gives us a totally incredible look into succession planning. We have to remember, we're talking about 7th century warfare here. Today, professional armies have distinct ranks, so if a commander goes down, the next in rank just automatically steps up. But back then, without any modern communication methods, it is fascinating to see how the Prophet issued explicit orders to account for the sheer intensity of fighting hardened Roman centurions. He appointed Zayd bin Haritha as commander. If Zayd fell, Ja'far ibn Abi Talib was to take over. If Ja'far was killed, then Abdullah ibn Rawaha. But what happens if all 3 of those guys fall? Well, the orders culminated in a remarkable directive for a battlefield election, which, as it turned out, ultimately led to Khalid ibn al-Walid taking command.
And this brilliantly illustrates how central executive authority actually accommodated democratic consensus, even in an absolute life-or-death emergency. The Arabic word used in the Prophet's command was yartad, which means to choose. The standing order was, if the 3rd commander is killed, let the Muslims choose a man from among themselves and make him their emir. And that's exactly what happened. The soldiers on the ground elected Khalid ibn al-Walid, fully acting on the prior established orders of the commander-in-chief. It's a stunning, brilliant example of structured devolution of power in the middle of a massive crisis.
All right, moving to Section 4, retaining tribal leaders.
As the state rapidly expanded, it had to deal pragmatically with existing power structures. It couldn't just tear everything down. For example, look at al-Harith ibn Abi Dirar, the leader of Banu al-Mustalik.
After his defeat at the Battle of Al-Marisi, he accepted Islam. And rather than being replaced or sidelined, he was actually confirmed right back into his position as chief by the central authority, managing his own region as a province under Medina. We see the exact same thing with Malik ibn Auf. This guy was a literal commander at the Battle of Hunain who fought against the Muslims, but after converting, he was appointed as an Amir, or governor, over his people. The central authority deliberately retained former enemies because those leaders already held the established trust and acceptance of their local populations. Talk about a practical approach to expansion, right?
Finally, let's look at Section 5, executive veto and suitability. Because here's the thing, local popularity wasn't the only metric for leadership. Let's look at the walled city of Taif to explore what happens when local popularity completely conflicts with suitability for public office. Taif was a really unique case. The Muslims couldn't penetrate its walls during a massive siege, but a year later a delegation voluntarily came to Medina. It was led by Abdul Yalil ibn Amr, a powerful local leader who had actually publicly humiliated and stoned the Prophet years earlier in Mecca. Now, though Abdul Yalil eventually accepted Islam after a ton of debate, his profound reluctance and argumentative nature made him highly unsuitable for a governorship. Instead, the central authority appointed Urwa ibn Masud. Urwa was literally just the delegation's guard, but he was incredibly eager to embrace and learn the religion, so we see that capability and suitability absolutely trumped past status.
And this brings us to a massively vital constitutional mechanism. While local elections and confirming existing popular leaders were very much the standard norm, the central executive maintained a final, undeniable veto. The head of state holds the executive power to dismiss or simply refuse to confirm local appointments to protect the public welfare. If an appointed or even elected official poses a threat of harm to the population of a province, the central authority steps in. Full stop.
Let's move to Simma and see how this builds off a deeply foundational legal maximum of this civilization. The Prophet explicitly stated, "There is no harm in reciprocating harm." This legal principle proves that leadership appointments, no matter how wildly popular a local figure might be, must never result in harm to the citizens. It acts as an overarching ethical and legal boundary on both decentralized democracy and centralized executive power. Which leaves us with this final thought. Today we've seen a system that demanded local elections for neighborhood administration, battlefield democracy in absolute emergencies, the practical retention of trusted local chiefs, but the whole shebang was completely balanced by a strict executive veto designed solely to prevent public harm. It is incredibly structured. So, I challenge you to reflect. How do these 7th century principles of balancing local autonomy with executive accountability compare to the political systems and governments we see operating in our world today? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this deep dive into the source material has given you a totally new, fresh perspective on the mechanics of historical governance. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.